Time to be a Misesian. I mean, look around you. There's over 50 people here. There was a time, in Mises' time, when there were probably about this many people in the whole country who understood Mises at all. Now, ever since the financial collapse 4 years ago, there's been a new resurgence of interest in Austrian economics. Although resurgence probably isn't the right word, there's been a new interest, we should say. If you look at the Google statistics, people searching, trying to understand these ideas of the boom and bust cycle, they skyrocketed after the fall of 2008. And it makes sense, because some of the only people who recognized that there was something wrong with this housing bubble during the Bush years, some of the only people who had any sort of prescience at all and any sort of clear understanding and ability to articulate what was wrong with it were in Mises' tradition. And we see people talking about these ideas more than ever. Often they're confused and they're critical, but I still think it's a good thing. In fact, just in the last week or so, there was an article by a conservative in the American Thinker that said that the reason he wasn't a libertarian was that libertarians have this kind of empty view of humanity, that all that we want is for people to try to maximize their desire, that we don't have any room in our philosophy for the spiritual, for anything beyond this very kind of naked, broken down, atomistic conception of humanity. And what was interesting was his whole argument was based on human action. Now, he didn't finish it. He read the first few hundred pages, and based on that, he thought that this was an accurate critique of the liberty philosophy. Now, there are a lot of problems with his article. I don't really have time to get into all of them. But I still think that it should encourage us that people are talking about it, that people feel that the ideas of Mises are worth criticizing. There was a time when most people in the popular literature, anyway, would have not thought it was worth criticizing. They didn't see that there were a lot of people reading online articles who they wanted to sway one way or the other. It was a very esoteric concern, Mises. Now, on the other hand, in the real world, it doesn't really seem like the power elite has read Mises or understood Mises at all. I mean, here we are, it's 2012, we have another round of quantitative easing, exactly 100 years after Mises explained the folly of this in the theory of money and credit. He understood this early on. And yet, all the elites throughout the world, of both mainstream conservatism and liberalism, don't get this at all, the problem with credit expansion. Now, I should say, before I continue, that I acknowledge that it's kind of odd that I'm up here. I mean, we have a room full of people who've read Mises, lots of it. Many of you understand these ideas probably as well as I do. And I'm not an economist. But on the other hand, I think that I can bring a little bit of perspective to all this. Mises thought that economics was too important to leave to the economists. He understood that economics was the pith of life and that we all had to do our best to understand this. I'm a student of history, and I thoroughly love the idea of human liberty. Every fiber of my being burns for the idea of a future where every individual on earth is free. And it's this love of freedom that attracted me to economics and to the Misesian tradition. Because as he explains time and again, you can't really understand politics or political philosophy or make sense of political history without a grounding in economics. You just can't. Now, also as a student of history, when I look at Mises, I can't help but see his crucial role in the history of ideas and in the history of statism and liberty. He lived in one of the darkest times to be a fervent believer of liberty. The first half of the 20th century was god-awful in so many respects. And he saw what very few other people saw. It must have been difficult. We know it was difficult. Day after day he did it, and he spoke the truth, and he argued for why freedom was the right ideal to pursue. Now, Mises, of course, adhered to this earlier philosophy of old classical liberalism. And he built upon this idea. He expounded upon it in new ways, while most of the rest of the world had abandoned it, including in the United States. And we saw two new threats to liberty emerge in his lifetime, and he called them both correctly. In 1917, the Bolsheviks took over Russia and unleashed a terror nearly unparalleled in human history. It was a dictatorship. There were torture chambers. Millions were exterminated. He liquidated the kulaks, and he had the greatest pretenses of knowledge that he could run an economy through force rather than through cooperation. And putting aside the idea of the violence and putting aside the obvious injustice of it all, there was a question of the economics. Because after all, in the 20th century, the enlightened intellectuals thought that they were above such quaint notions of liberty as a political philosophy, because it wasn't scientific. They believed that the state was more scientific than trade, than markets, than entrepreneurs. And yet, even on that basis, he met them on their own grounds and defeated them decisively with the most thorough, devastating critique of socialism in terms of the economics of it ever written. In 1920, his paper on economic calculation of the socialist commonwealth, and then a couple years later, expanding upon it in socialism. And he identified the key problem that no one had quite understood. Now, the Austrians in the late 19th century had begun this sparring with the Marxists. They had argued about this, but he put it in terms that were irrefutable. You need prices. And you can't have prices without freedom. You can't have prices without markets. The state cannot emulate prices. There have been attempts, and the socialists since then have said the state can come up with prices out of thin air, or it could look at markets outside of its jurisdiction. But Mises showed that even if every individual who lived in a socialist state wanted socialism to work, even if we all burned with a desire to make it work, even if we were willing to work 16 hours a day as comrades to bring about the proletarian revolution, it would fail utterly in all of its supposed humanitarian goals because you need prices. And he laid this out clearly. Now, tragically, it was almost 70 years before the world realized how right he was when the internal contradictions of the Soviet Union brought that horrible regime down. But he knew it then. And yet the intellectuals at the time, they were enamored of Lenin and then later Stalin. And in fact, the counterweight to this wasn't liberalism of the old school. It became something that also threatened liberty. In the 20s and especially the 30s, any enlightened intellectual in the West, if they weren't a socialist, they were a fascist. In fact, the geopolitical pragmatists thought that Mussolini, some of them even thought maybe Hitler, could be a bulwark against the Soviet Union. Of course, Mises never fell for this. He understood that a lot of the core problems with socialism, putting aside the morality of it, could be found in fascism too. And he feared, living in Austria, that the Germans would eventually take over his country. He spent his whole life there, or he spent all his time up to then in Austria, fighting against Bolshevism, fighting against credit expansion, and now he saw the threat of Germany before most other people did. And he was truly prescient, and he fled Switzerland because he feared the Germans would take over that too. And his fears were well grounded, because the Nazis, the day that they took over Austria, they ransacked his Austrian apartment, they took all his papers. And some of the Austrian scholars who stayed behind did not fare so well. At least one died in a concentration camp. And then Mises came here and he wrote Omnipotent Government, the most thorough prescient critique of National Socialism, showing that it wasn't capitalism to blame, as the Marxists thought. It was another form of central planning that was potentially just as evil. That total war and the total state represented the negation of liberalism as well. Now, of course, in 1949, the English-speaking world was lucky to have Human Action published. His treatise, an edifice of a system of thought that's unparalleled to this day. He built upon these concepts that humans act. And, some postmodernists might disagree. But the very attempt to refute the fact that human acts, Humans Act is, of course, an admission in Humans Act. And it sounds obvious to us, but that's the paradox of Mises. Sentence by sentence, he's so clear that he pulls you along. He explains things so well that you say, well, of course, once you digest it. But the paradox is, it's so sophisticated. He anticipates any counter-argument you might have, and then he addresses it in the next sentence. So sentence by sentence, it's simultaneously the greatest intellectual challenge you'll confront, and yet it's so graceful, that whole book. You know, his critique of polylogism, his critique of every form of interventionism, even oppression critique of drug prohibition that makes the 1960s and 70s radicals look like they were behind the curve. He understood every problem with state intervention, from beginning to those last words, where he says, if you ignore this, you're not just going to annul economics, you'll stamp out society and the human race. And I want to close talking about his last great work, Theory and History, because I am a lover of history. Mises and his whole tradition have been criticized by being too a priori, by thinking that an economic theory can stand without consulting empirical data. That's the core criticism. It's not scientific. You don't have models. You don't have graphs. You don't have meaningless appendices full of data explaining potato prices going up and down. So how do you know that if you put price controls on potatoes, there'll be a shortage? How could you know? Well, he explains so clearly the distinction between economics and history. But he does it with a great deference to both disciplines that you'll try very hard to find in any other great thinker. Because he knew that an economic theory was either sound on the basis of the basic principles of human action, or it wasn't. And empirical data can't refute a sound theory, nor can empirical data bolster an unsound theory. But on the other hand, he knew that we're not automatons, that there's a world outside the material that we can't really measure, and that's ideas. We are human beings. We're different from rocks. We're different from plants. We're guided by ideas, and these ideas have their own reality. And because we have ideas, no boom and bust will be the same. These attempts to predict exactly when the market will crash are folly. And that's the importance of history. You need empirical data to understand what's actually happened, because no model will tell you what has happened or what will happen. So he has this great respect for both these disciplines that I wish more people who believed in liberty had. Economists need to study history, and historians need to understand economics, or else they won't make heads or tails of the world. And this fact that he focuses on ideas, I think, is his greatest contribution. Because we are motivated by ideas, and ideas shape the society we live in. Two things more than anything else determine whether we live under tyranny or freedom. One is the laws of economics. The state cannot, thank goodness, do everything it seeks to. And the other is the ideology, the beliefs of the people. And he understood this. He understood the core centrality of ideas. And in one of his most stirring quotes, one that puts the lie to this very idea that we, as freedom lovers, see a world of automatons who have no responsibility to one another. It puts the lie to this idea that we don't understand the importance of society. He explained very clearly that every person, as he put it, everyone, carries a part of society on their shoulders. No one can be relieved of responsibility by others. No one can find himself a safe way out when society is sweeping toward destruction. And so everyone, in his own self-interest, must thrust himself vigorously into the intellectual battle. It's never been as important a time to join that battle, and we've never had as many comrades to do it. And thanks to Mises, we'll always be well armed. Thank you.